For most of her life, Julia never questioned the path she was on. A successful woman in her early 40s, she had built an empire from the ground up. Her business was thriving, her reputation untouchable. The world saw her as a force to be reckoned with, independent, powerful, and driven. But when the office lights dimmed and the last email was sent, Julia felt the emptiness creeping in. She had everything anyone could want: money, respect, influence, but there was something missing, something no amount of success could fill: love. After her divorce, Julia found herself wandering through life, surrounded by colleagues and acquaintances, but never truly seen. The endless board meetings, the late-night calls, they all became just noise. The days blurred into one another. She was respected, admired, but no one really knew her, not the real her. The woman who still believed in the possibility of love, the woman who longed for a connection that went beyond the business deals, beyond the polished exterior. And then he appeared. Marcus. It started innocently enough: an introduction at a gala, a chance encounter after a long day of negotiations. He had a way about him, something magnetic, something that immediately drew her in. It wasn't just his good looks, though he certainly had those. It was his warmth, his charm, and the way he made Julia feel seen. Not for her business success or her accomplishments, but for the woman she was underneath it all. They talked. At first, it was the usual pleasantries: work, travel, the city. But Marcus had a way of asking questions that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. His eyes never wandered, his smile never faded. With every conversation, Julia found herself letting her guard down more and more, something she hadn't done in years. She had always been in control of everything in her life: her business, her finances, her destiny. He didn't ask for much, just time, just her attention. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Julia began to let him in. She began sharing parts of herself she hadn't in a long time, dreams she had buried, fears she had forgotten. Marcus listened. In his presence, Julia felt like she could finally exhale. All the years of hard work and sacrifice, of building walls to protect herself, seemed to melt away. For the first time in ages, she imagined a future where she wasn't alone, where she wasn't just the CEO, but a woman who could share her life with someone who understood her. It was the kind of fantasy she had convinced herself she no longer needed, but Marcus made her believe in it again. He told her he admired her strength, her ambition. He spoke about his own life, his own struggles. There was a certain vulnerability to him that Julia couldn't quite place, but it was the kind of vulnerability that felt real, not manufactured. It was the kind of vulnerability she knew she could trust. Soon, their meetings became more frequent. They went for long walks in the park, shared quiet dinners at small, intimate restaurants. Marcus never seemed rushed, never seemed like he had somewhere else to be. He made Julia feel like she was the most important person in the world. And for someone who had spent years running a company, fighting for every ounce of respect she had earned, Julia convinced herself she had finally found someone who could handle her, someone who understood the complexities of her life. She had been so focused on her career that she hadn't realized how much she craved companionship, how much she longed to feel truly seen. By the time they went on their first vacation together, Julia was already imagining what it might be like to have Marcus by her side, permanently. What started as a simple fling, a way to escape the weight of her responsibilities, was turning into something more. And for the first time in years, Julia felt the spark of something real, something deep. She wasn't just the CEO anymore. She wasn't just the woman who ran the show. She was Julia, the woman in love. For weeks, Julia couldn't believe her luck. Every moment spent with Marcus felt like a dream she hadn't known she was waiting for. There were no hidden agendas, no games, just the feeling of being truly seen. He made her laugh, made her feel alive again, like the world had opened up just for her. Every conversation seemed effortless, every moment together filled with meaning. Marcus listened in a way no one else had. When Julia spoke about her career, he didn't just nod and agree like so many others. He asked questions, thoughtful ones, that made her feel valued, like her opinions mattered beyond the boardroom. He shared his life with her too, but in a way that was strangely captivating. He spoke of his past, though he had grown up with humble beginnings, how he'd fought to build a better life. There was a certain sadness in his voice when he talked about the loss of family, the tragedies that had shaped him into the man he was today. Julia had always been drawn to vulnerability. Something about it made people real, made them human. And Marcus's story, though tragic, was one she could relate to. She, too, had faced loss in her life, her failed marriage, her estranged relationships with distant relatives. It seemed they both understood what it felt like to rebuild, to stand on their own and carve a new path. But what really took her by surprise was how effortlessly he slipped into her world. Marcus didn't just talk about the things he'd done, he talked about the things he wanted to do. He painted a picture of a future that included her. He wasn't pushy or demanding. He simply made her feel as though the future was a beautiful, natural extension of everything they were building together. It was subtle, but over time Marcus began to guide the relationship in ways Julia didn't fully understand. He took the lead when it came to planning their dates, organizing weekends away, suggesting changes to her daily routine, small, seemingly harmless suggestions, but Julia didn't question it. After all, Marcus was always there, always present, always thinking ahead. She felt cared for, and that care became everything. But Julia's heart wasn't the only thing Marcus was working to win. Over time, he subtly took control of other aspects of her life, the little things at first. He would suggest better ways for her to manage her business, claiming that he just wanted to help her. "You've worked so hard," he'd say. "You deserve to take a break. Let me handle this." It was always offered with a smile, with the promise that it was in her best interest. And at first, Julia welcomed the help. She was tired. She had spent years managing every detail of her life, every minute of every day. The idea of someone else taking the reins, even just a little, felt like a relief. But then it escalated. One day, Marcus casually mentioned that he had gone ahead and made some changes to her finances, suggesting she might benefit from a different approach. "Just a few adjustments here and there," he'd said. "I've been researching some things that could make your life easier." Julia brushed it off. She didn't have the time or energy to micromanage every detail. She trusted Marcus. He was smart, thoughtful, and he clearly wanted what was best for her. It wasn't until later, after some small discrepancies started to pop up in her accounts, that she realized how deeply he had woven himself into the fabric of her life. But by then, it was too late. Over the next few months, Julia's world became increasingly intertwined with Marcus's. They started talking about the future more seriously. He suggested that they move in together. "It wasn't a rush," he said, "just a natural progression. We're a team, Julia," he would remind her, "and being together 24/7 will only make us stronger." Julia, still caught up in the whirlwind of their romance, agreed. There was something comforting about the idea of sharing her space with him, of coming home every night to someone who was there, who cared. But moving in together didn't just mean sharing a home, it meant sharing everything. Marcus had a way of taking up all the space emotionally, mentally, physically. It was as if he wanted to be everywhere all the time. The first time Julia truly questioned Marcus's influence was when she found herself sitting alone one evening, looking at a piece of paper he had presented to her, a list of ways he thought they could simplify her business operations. It all sounded reasonable at the time, but the more she read it, the more it felt like he was trying to pull her away from the things that had built her success. "Let me handle your affairs," he had said. "I'll make the hard decisions so you don't have to." Julia hesitated, but only for a moment. What was the harm? After all, Marcus had only ever shown his support. The love they shared seemed real, and in that moment, Julia convinced herself that she was just overthinking things. But that's the thing about control, it's often disguised as care. As weeks passed, Julia found herself relying on Marcus more and more. She started to confide in him about things she had once kept to herself, her insecurities, Her fears about growing older, her doubts about the future. Marcus was always there to listen, to reassure her. And each time he did, he planted more seeds of doubt in her mind. Not about him, no, but about herself. "You've done everything on your own for so long, Julia," he would say. "Maybe it's time to let someone else take the reins for a while. You've earned the rest." The more she leaned on Marcus, the more she began to trust him with her decisions, her thoughts, even her finances. She let him take the lead in places she would never have considered before. After all, he was the man who understood her, the man who cared. And with every step they took forward together, Julia's world became a little less hers and a little more his. But she couldn't see it, not yet. Not when she was still caught up in the beauty of what seemed like a perfect love story. It wasn't until much later that Julia would finally realize the full extent of Marcus's influence and just how much of herself she had given away in the process. A future he saw with her by his side. He spoke about planned trips to places she'd never been, quiet weekends away from the hustle of work. For the first time in years, Julia allowed herself to dream beyond the office, beyond the spreadsheets and meetings that had filled her life. There was a certain sweetness in his gestures. Every morning, he'd show up at her door with coffee or a fresh bouquet of flowers. He'd surprise her with little gifts, things that showed he was paying attention, her favorite book, a rare bottle of wine. It was easy to fall for him, so easy. He made it all feel so effortless, like they were two souls who had always been meant to find each other. And in those early days, Julia found herself letting go of the walls she had built over the years. She found herself opening up, sharing parts of her past she had never spoken about, secrets she had kept locked away. In return, Marcus opened up too. His charm never wavered. He continued to listen with patience, and the affection he showed seemed genuine. He made her feel like the most important person in the room every time. As their relationship grew, so did his presence in her life. Slowly, Marcus became a fixture. It wasn't just dinner dates anymore. He was at her office, helping her with decisions, organizing her schedule, even picking up groceries for her when she was too busy. It felt natural. He encouraged her to take breaks, to let him handle things when she couldn't. "You've worked hard enough," he would say, flashing that smile that made her melt. "Let me take care of you for once." At first, Julia resisted. She had always been the one to take charge, to be in control. But there was something in his eyes that made it hard to refuse. Slowly, she started letting him take more responsibility, handling her affairs, dealing with contractors for her property, even managing her personal finances. He assured her it was just to ease her load, that she had worked so hard and deserved to relax. His attention became all-consuming, but in a way that felt almost necessary. As the months passed, their relationship deepened. Julia had fallen in love with him. She saw a future with Marcus where they built something together, where they traveled, where they lived their best lives. They began discussing marriage, a future beyond just the fleeting moments they shared. Marcus would talk about it casually at first, slipping it into their conversations like it was already a given. But it wasn't until one evening, over a quiet dinner at her apartment, that he asked her directly. "Julia," he said, his voice soft, yet serious. "I know this might seem fast, but I can't imagine my life without you. You've brought so much joy to it, and I want to build something real with you, something lasting." Julia looked at him, her heart racing. Was this really happening? Could this be the future she had always dreamed of? Without hesitation, she nodded. "Yes, Marcus, I feel the same way." And just like that, they were planning a life together, a life that seemed perfect in every way. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect relationship, there were subtle signs Julia began to ignore, signs that, in hindsight, would reveal the cracks in Marcus's facade. For now, though, Julia was happy. She was in love. She was ready for a new chapter. The life she had built on her own was about to intertwine with Marcus's, and for the first time in years, Julia felt secure. But as Marcus grew more embedded in her life, She didn't see that he was already laying the groundwork for something darker, something more dangerous. As the weeks went by, his actions started to raise questions, but Julia brushed them off. She had invested too much emotionally to see the truth. Her trust in Marcus had become her blind spot. What she didn't know was that every gesture of affection, every carefully crafted word, was part of a well-rehearsed act. He wasn't the man he appeared to be not at all, and the man she thought she knew was slowly unraveling before her eyes. At first, Julia couldn't put her finger on it. It was small things, insignificant details, fleeting moments that didn't seem to add up. The way Marcus would dismiss certain questions, his vague answers to some of her inquiries. He always had an excuse, a reason that sounded plausible enough to silence her doubts. But the more time passed, the more these little inconsistencies began to pile up. One evening, after dinner, Julia sat across from Marcus at her kitchen table, casually scrolling through her phone. He had just come back from a business trip, and she noticed something strange, a change in his demeanor. He was quieter than usual, his responses more clipped. She attributed it to the stress of travel, but there was an unease in the air she couldn't shake. "Is everything all right?" Julia asked, setting her phone down. Marcus smiled, a quick flash of charm, but there was something forced about it. "Of course," he said, brushing off her concern. "Just a long day, you know how it is." She nodded, but something about his words didn't sit right. In the beginning, Marcus would have opened up about his day, the people he met, the things he experienced. But now, his stories seemed rehearsed, almost robotic. He wasn't sharing anymore. And then there were the small details about his past, the stories he told about his family, the tragedies that had shaped him over time. Julia started noticing discrepancies. One minute, he spoke of a brother he had lost in a car accident years ago. The next, he'd mention a sister who had died of cancer. Which was it? A brother or a sister? The inconsistency was subtle, but it bothered Julia, especially because she had never pressed him too hard. He had seemed so open before. And then there was his sudden need for space. At first, it was nothing major, just a quiet weekend away on his own to recharge. But then, it became more frequent. Weeks would go by where Marcus would retreat into himself, spending long hours at work or going for long, unexplained runs. He would dismiss her concerns with a wave, claiming he needed time to clear his head. Julia tried not to let it bother her. After all, everyone needed their space, right? But still, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. It was during one of these moments that she began to wonder about his true intentions. They were sitting on the couch together one evening, watching TV in the dim light of her living room. Marcus was quiet, his eyes glued to the screen, his arm around her shoulders. But Julia couldn't stop thinking about the small discrepancies, the subtle changes she'd been noticing in his behavior. "Marcus," she said slowly, turning to face him, her voice quiet but steady. "Is everything okay? I just feel like you're distant lately. You've been different." He turned to her, his smile as charming as ever. "What do you mean, distant?" he asked, his tone light, almost teasing. "I'm right here, aren't I?" She didn't respond right away. His words were smooth, his demeanor disarming, but something in his eyes, the way his smile faltered for just a second, made her pause. She had seen that look before. It was the same look he had when he was hiding something, when he was trying too hard to reassure her. "I don't know," she said, pulling away slightly. "It just feels like you're pulling away from me. Maybe I'm overthinking it, but I thought we had something real, Marcus." His hand found hers, his grip tightening just a little too much. "You're just stressed. You've been working too hard. We both have. You know I'm here for you. I'm not going anywhere." His words sounded good, comforting, but there was something in the way he said it that didn't sit right with Julia. It was as if he were trying to convince her, not just her, but himself too. Later that night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Julia couldn't shake the feeling of doubt. What was happening to the man she had fallen for? The warm, open Marcus she had known seemed to be slipping away, replaced by someone different. Someone guarded, secretive, as if there was a side of him she had yet to see. The next day, she decided to dig a little deeper. Julia had always prided herself on her instincts, her ability to read people, to see through the facades they put up. But for the first time in her life, she didn't want to believe what she was starting to feel, that Marcus might not be who he claimed to be, that there was a darker side to him, a side he had been hiding all along. She began to look into his background more closely. The stories he told about his past seemed more and more fabricated as she pieced things together. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, Julia discovered something she hadn't expected. An old social media account that Marcus had once used, now long abandoned. It contained photographs of other women, other relationships, some of which looked strikingly similar to her own. Julia felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It was all starting to make sense now, the gifts, the attention, the constant praise. Marcus had been here before, and before that. He wasn't just playing her. He had been playing this game with countless others. Julia was just another pawn in his sick little game. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The man she had trusted, the man she had opened her heart to, was nothing more than a con artist, a predator who had been using her for his own gain. Her heart raced, her mind spinning. She didn't know what to do next. Should she confront him? Should she leave? The thought of confronting Marcus terrified her. She wasn't sure she could face the man she thought she knew, the man who had lied so expertly to her face. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let him continue this charade. Not when she had finally started to see the truth. Julia's world had just cracked open, and there was no going back. Which was it? A brother or a sister? It didn't seem to matter to Marcus, and every time Julia asked for clarification, his responses became less specific, more evasive. He'd brush off her questions with a soft chuckle, saying it didn't matter now, it was all in the past. But for Julia, it mattered. It didn't make sense, and when something doesn't make sense, a seed of doubt begins to grow. As the weeks went on, she started noticing even more subtle inconsistencies in Marcus's behavior. There were the occasional phone calls he'd take in private, his voice lowered, his words clipped. He always reassured her it was work, something he needed to handle. But Julia couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. Why all the secrecy? And then there was his increasing influence on her life. At first it was harmless and off-taking over small tasks, helping with the daily chores. But soon, he was making bigger decisions for her. He'd suggest financial moves, investments, changes to her business strategy, things that Julia hadn't asked for and didn't need. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, he casually mentioned that he'd been looking into ways to improve her finances. "You've been doing great," he said, his voice smooth. "But with a little help, you could do so much more." It sounded innocent, like any supportive partner offering advice. But something about the way he said it made Julia uneasy. Why was he so involved in her business? Why did he feel the need to make her life better when it seemed she was already in control? At first, she brushed it off as him just being helpful. But the more he pushed, the more she questioned his motives. Was he really looking out for her? Or was he starting to exert control over every aspect of her life? There were other small but unsettling moments. He had become a constant presence in her home, more so than before. One afternoon, Julia returned from a meeting to find that Marcus had redecorated her living room without asking. The new furniture was lovely, but the choice of pieces felt off. Why had he felt the need to make changes to her space, her personal sanctuary? When she confronted him, he smiled, a reassuring gesture, and explained that he just wanted to make her feel comfortable. But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't about comfort, it was about ownership. And then, there were the oddities surrounding his past. He often spoke about a previous relationship, a woman he had loved and lost. He mentioned her in passing, but his tone was always strangely detached, as though there was more to the story that he was unwilling to reveal. "She wasn't the one," Marcus would say with a shrug. "You know how it is, sometimes things just don't work out." But Julia couldn't help but wonder, why didn't he want to talk about her more? Was there something he was hiding about that chapter of his life? The breaking point came one weekend, When Julia decided to do a bit of digging on her own, she went through some old paperwork while Marcus was out, looking for old documents she'd meant to go through. It was then that she found something strange, a set of financial records that didn't make sense. There were accounts in his name, accounts that she didn't recognize. Large sums of money were being transferred back and forth, with no clear explanation. Her heart raced as she dug deeper, each discovery raising more questions than answers. It felt like a trail of breadcrumbs leading her into a maze she wasn't sure she wanted to navigate. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how little she actually knew about Marcus. Was he hiding things from her? Had she been so blinded by love that she hadn't seen the truth? The final clue came late one night when she overheard a conversation. Marcus was on the phone, and his voice was low. Julia couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the urgency in his voice. There was something off about it. She listened closely, her heart pounding in her chest. "Don't worry, it'll all go according to plan," Marcus said, his words laced with an unsettling confidence. "She won't suspect a thing." Julia froze, the weight of his words crashing over her like a tidal wave. Her mind raced, her body went cold. What plan? Who was he talking to? And most importantly, who was she? In that moment, everything changed. The man she had trusted, the man she thought she knew, suddenly felt like a stranger. Julia realized that her instincts had been right all along. Something was terribly wrong, and the life she had built, the love she had trusted, was beginning to crumble beneath her feet. Julia had reached a breaking point. The doubts that had been creeping in for weeks were no longer small. Nagging thoughts, they had become a storm she could no longer ignore. The inconsistencies, the evasions, the manipulations, they were all adding up. She had to know the truth. It was late one evening when Julia finally made the decision. Marcus had just left for one of his business trips, and something in the air told her this would be the right moment. He had left his phone on the kitchen counter, a habit he never usually did. It was just a quick glance, she told herself, a way to ease the weight in her chest. She wasn't snooping, she was just looking for answers. What she found was far more than she ever expected. Messages, dozens of them, texts, emails, conversations that she could barely make sense of at first. But then, the picture became clearer. There were names she didn't recognize, numbers she didn't know. It didn't take long for Julia to understand these weren't just business contacts. They were victims. Messages from women, notes of gratitude for the help he had given them, help that now seemed to have strings attached. Each message began with a similar tone. "I'll never forget what you've done for me, Marcus. You've given me a life I never thought was possible." Her heart pounded as she scrolled through them, her fingers trembling. One text from a woman named Rachel stood out. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done for me. I don't know what I'd have done without you, but I'm scared." The fear in that message sent chills down her spine, and there, buried deep in a folder of messages, was a thread that nearly stopped her heart. It was from Marcus, and it was addressed to someone else. "I'll make sure Julia is taken care of. Just like the others. She'll be a good investment." Julia's blood ran cold. Her instincts had been right all along. Marcus wasn't who he claimed to be. He wasn't the kind, gentle man who had swept her off her feet. A man who saw women like her not as partners, but as prey. He was manipulating her, using her trust to weave an even larger web. It was clear now this was no accident. Everything was a calculated move. Julia's thoughts were racing. She felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. How could she have been so blind? All the signs had been there, the secrecy, the influence, the strange decisions. He had played her every step of the way, and now she was just another name on a list of women he had used and discarded. But this discovery wasn't just a crushing betrayal, it was a call to action. Julia couldn't let Marcus get away with this. She couldn't let him hurt anyone else the way he had hurt her. She had to confront him. The plan was set into motion quickly. Julia knew Marcus would be back from his trip within a few days. She couldn't wait. The next few days were a blur of preparations, gathering evidence, making phone calls, consulting her lawyer. She knew she had to be careful. If Marcus suspected anything, he could easily turn the tables, twist the narrative. He was too clever, too manipulative. Julia couldn't let that happen. The confrontation would be on her terms. When Marcus finally returned, the tension between them was unbearable. The man who had once seemed so charming and loving now felt like a stranger, a threat. Julia had never been more certain of anything in her life. She was done with the lies, the manipulation. She would no longer be his pawn. They sat together in her living room that evening, the same space where they had once shared laughter and plans for a future. Now, it felt cold, oppressive. Marcus looked at her, his smile forced, his eyes watching her carefully. "Julia," he said softly, trying to draw her in with his usual charm. "Is everything okay? You've been acting strange since I got back." Julia didn't smile. She didn't even respond right away. She simply pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. The screen lit up, showing the text threads, the emails, the messages. Marcus looked at it, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he sighed. A deep, defeated sound, as if he had known this moment was coming but had hoped to avoid it. "Julia," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic, "I didn't want you to see this, but now that you have, I suppose there's no turning back." His words were almost too calm, too rehearsed. It was as if he had been preparing for this moment, knowing that one day the truth would be uncovered. "You've known all along, haven't you?" Julia said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You've been using Mellying to me, just like you've done to every other woman before me." Marcus didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her with an almost cold, detached look. "I didn't want to hurt you, Julia. You were special. But it's all part of the plan, you see. I never meant for you to get caught up in this. But it happened, and now we just need to move forward. You'll understand when you're in the position I'm in." His words were chilling, but there was a certain calm in his demeanor, as if he believed he still had control of the situation. Julia's heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt so betrayed, so vulnerable. "I'm done with you, Marcus," she said, her voice steady now, the tears she had been holding back finally slipping down her cheeks. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you really are. You won't hurt anyone else. Not like this." Marcus's face darkened. His mask of charm slipped, revealing the man underneath the predator who had been hiding in plain sight. "You think you can stop me?" he spat, his voice harsh now, filled with venom. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Julia stood up, her heart racing but her resolve stronger than ever. She wasn't going to let him threaten her. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her into silence. "Watch me," she whispered. And for the first time in months, Julia felt a sense of power surge through her real power, the kind that came from knowing the truth and finally taking control. It was over. For both of them. "I don't know what I'd have done without you, Marcus. You saved me. I will always be grateful." The message ended with a note of affection, but Julia could feel the weight behind the words. They were declarations of dependence, of women who had become entangled in Marcus's web. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes fell upon another message. This one was from a woman named Laura, and it was different. It wasn't a thank you, it was a plea. "Marcus, please. I know what you did. You can't keep running from this. People are starting to notice." The rest of the message was a string of desperate words, a warning about some kind of truth that was about to come to light. Julia's stomach churned. She felt like she was drowning in this sea of hidden messages, each one painting a clearer picture of a man she didn't recognize. But it wasn't just the texts that unsettled her. There was something else, something even more chilling. As she scrolled through Marcus's emails, one subject line caught her eye: Sandra's final will. It was a document, sent from a lawyer. Julia clicked it open, her heart racing. The will was a simple one, too simple. It was a document that named Marcus as the sole beneficiary of a fortune that had once belonged to someone else's someone Julia didn't know, but who, now, she couldn't ignore. The name Sandra appeared again and again, a connection she couldn't yet place. Marcus had been involved in something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Her mind was spinning, trying to piece everything together. Julia sat there, staring at the screen, her thoughts racing. She had trusted him with her heart, with her life, and now it felt like it had all been a game to him. The worst part? She realized it wasn't the first time he'd done this. Julia picked up the phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the number from one of the texts. It was time to find out the truth, time to confront the women who had been touched by Marcus's manipulation. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to wait any longer. The phone rang, and when the woman on the other end answered, Julia barely knew how to speak. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was tentative, unsure. Julia took a deep breath. I need to know about Marcus. What has he done to you?" There was a pause, followed by a shaky sigh. "You don't know what he's capable of, do you? He's done it to so many of us. He comes in, charms us, makes us believe we're the one, makes us believe we're special. And then, the voice broke, and then he takes everything and leaves you with nothing but regret." Julia felt a knot form in her stomach, but she pressed on. "What happened to Sandra? What is all this about her will?" The voice on the other end was quiet for a long time before answering. "He's been playing this game for years. Sandra was one of his victims too, but she wasn't like the others. She wasn't as easy to manipulate. That's why he had to do what he did. You need to be careful. You're in danger too." Julia felt a cold rush of fear. Everything, all at once, came crashing down on her. Marcus wasn't just a charming man who had stolen her hearth, was a predator, using his charm to exploit, to manipulate, to ruin. The truth was worse than she could have ever imagined, and now she knew she had to confront him. But as Julia looked down at the phone in her hand, one thought lingered in her mind. How could she have been so blind? She stood up, pacing the room. Her heart was racing. But even as she steeled herself for what was coming, she couldn't shake the fear that she was already too deep in his web. The next day, Julia waited for Marcus to return, her mind a whirl of emotions sang her, fear, confusion. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about stopping him before he could do it to anyone else. When he walked through the door, everything seemed normal, too normal. His smile was the same, his usual warmth radiated from him as he entered the room. But Julia wasn't fooled anymore. She stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady, though inside she was shaking. He looked at her with that same calm, confident smile. "What's going on, Julia? You look tense." But Julia wasn't having it. "I know what you've been doing. I know everything." Marcus froze, his expression faltering for just a moment. But in that brief hesitation, Julia saw the real man beneath the mask. The one who wasn't concerned with love, with connection. The one who had been lying to her, using her all along. "You think you can fool me forever?" she demanded, stepping closer. "You've played this game with so many women, and now you're going to answer for it." Marcus took a step back, but his smile never wavered. "Julia, this isn't what you think. You're overreacting. I care about you." The words were empty. Julia's mind was racing, but she wasn't backing down. "No, Marcus, you don't get to manipulate me anymore. You've hurt too many people, and now it's over." For the first time, Marcus's composure slipped. He took another step back, but this time there was fear in his eyes. Fear of being exposed, fear of losing control. Julia didn't care. She had uncovered the truth, and she was done. The police arrived soon after Julia uncovered the truth. With the evidence she had found on Marcus's phone and the wealth of hidden messages that painted a clear picture of his manipulation, she wasted no time in contacting the authorities. What she learned in those dark hours shook her to the core. Marcus wasn't just a charming man with a mysterious past, was a con artist, a predator who had carefully cultivated relationships with multiple women, each time with the same goal: to gain access to their wealth, to control their lives, and to slowly, methodically strip them of everything they held dear. But it wasn't just about money, it was about power. Marcus had played the part of a loving partner, a devoted man who could do no wrong. He had spent years constructing the perfect image that not only fooled Julia, but countless others. Behind his affable smile and comforting words, he had caused so much pain, leaving a trail of broken hearts, shattered trust, and destroyed lives. And when Julia finally connected the dots between the women he had deceived and the mysterious Sandra, it became clear he had done this before. He had manipulated Sandra, a wealthy woman he had once courted, until she was financially drained and emotionally broken. It wasn't until Sandra's sudden death that the full extent of his plan began to unravel. As Marcus sat in jail awaiting trial, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a nightmare she would wake up from. But when the trial began, it was clear this was no dream. It was a living, breathing nightmare, and the truth was more harrowing than she could have ever imagined. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. As the prosecution laid out their case, it became clear just how far Marcus's manipulation had reached. The evidence was overwhelming: text messages, emails, documents, and testimonies from his former victims. Each woman who took the stand painted a picture of a man who had weaseled his way into their lives, promising love and companionship, only to reveal his true nature once they were fully entranced. Julia sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth she had uncovered. Every woman who spoke brought a fresh wave of pain, and yet each story was a reminder of why she had to stand strong. She couldn't let Marcus's lies go unpunished. Not for herself, but for all the others he had hurt. The testimony from Sandra's family was especially moving. Her daughter Kira had spent years suspecting that her mother's death wasn't as natural as it appeared. She had found the toxicology report, which revealed traces of drugs in Sandra's system that shouldn't have been there. Kira's testimony was emotional, her voice trembling as she described the pain of losing her mother and how Marcus had been the one to seal Sandra's fate. It was during these moments that the full extent of Marcus's manipulation came to light. His method was simple, almost too simple to believe. He had taken advantage of vulnerable women, offering them the love and companionship they had longed for, only to use them as stepping stones for his own gain. He preyed on their loneliness, their insecurities, and their need to feel valued. He promised them the world, and when they were too deep into the relationship to turn back, he took everything: money, trust, and in some cases, their lives. With every piece of evidence presented, the case against Marcus grew stronger, and yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Marcus never faltered. He sat in the defendant's chair, a mask of calm plastered across his face, his eyes devoid of emotion. It was as if he believed he was untouchable, that his charm and manipulation could save him from the inevitable. Julia watched him closely, her gaze unwavering. She had spent so long doubting her instincts, second-guessing the small signs that she had ignored. But now, in this moment, she knew one thing for sure: Marcus was guilty, and the truth would come to light, no matter how much he tried to hide behind his facade. As the trial neared its end, Julia took the stand. She had never imagined she would find herself in such a position, but as the prosecution called for her to speak, she knew it was her moment to make her voice heard. She told her story: how she had met Marcus, how he had charmed his way into her life, and how, in the end, she had uncovered the truth. She spoke of the lies, the deceit, and the hurt. She spoke of the trust she had placed in him and how he had shattered it. But what Julia didn't expect was the sense of empowerment that came with speaking her truth. As she looked at Marcus across the courtroom, she no longer saw the charming man who had once swept her off her feet. She saw the man who had broken her, who had broken so many others, and who was now going to pay for his actions. When the verdict finally came, it was clear that justice had been served. Marcus was convicted on multiple counts: fraud, manipulation, abuse of power, and even murder. The jury had seen through his mask, and the truth had won out. In the days that followed, Julia found herself reflecting on everything that had happened: the good, the bad, and the painful lessons she had learned. The man she had thought she knew, the man she had believed was her future, was nothing more than a predator in disguise. But Julia wasn't defined by her past, and she wasn't going to let Marcus define her future. The road to healing would take time, but she knew now that she was strong enough to walk it. She had faced the truth, and now, for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, a sense that, no matter what came next, she would never again be deceived by the man who had almost stolen everything from her. The trial was over, but the journey was just beginning. For Julia, the path forward was one of self-discovery, of rebuilding her life from the ashes of betrayal. It would take time, but she was no longer afraid of what the future held. She had come through the storm and emerged stronger on the other side than she could have ever imagined. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of the accusations. Julia sat in the back, feeling the eyes of the entire room on her. There were whispers and murmurs as people wondered how a woman like her could have been taken in by a man like Marcus. But Julia wasn't here to explain herself. She was here for justice, for the victims, for herself. The trial was a spectacle as the prosecution laid out their case. The evidence against Marcus was damning. They presented the messages Julia had uncovered, the forged documents, the manipulative tactics he had used to gain access to women's wealth and trust. They brought in testimonies from other women who had fallen victim to his charms, each one recounting the heartbreak, the betrayal, and the devastation they had faced when they realized the man they loved was a fraud. As the trial progressed, Julia's heart broke for them, for the women who had been just like her, caught in Marcus's web of lies. It was clear now that he had been using the same tactics over and over again, playing on each woman's vulnerability, gaining their trust, and then stripping them of their dignity, their money, their lives. When Julia's turn to testify came, she stood tall in the witness box, her hands trembling, but her voice unwavering. She recounted how Marcus had charmed her, how he had made her feel special, like she was the only woman in the world who mattered. She spoke of how she had believed in him, how he had made her believe in love again. And then she told them of the betrayal phone, the messages, the truth she had uncovered. She didn't hold back, not anymore. As she spoke, Marcus sat across the courtroom, his face a mask of calm. But Julia could see the cracks. She could see the anger in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when her words hit home. It was in that moment that she realized Marcus was not a man who would ever accept defeat. He had built his entire life on deceit, on manipulation. And now, with everything crumbling around him, he had nothing left to lose. The trial continued for several weeks, each day revealing more of Marcus's calculated actions. The defense tried to argue that Julia and the other women were simply misunderstanding Marcus's intentions, that they had misinterpreted his gestures of affection as manipulation, but the evidence spoke for itself. The pattern was undeniable, and the jury knew it. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom fell silent. The tension that had been building for months reached its peak. The judge read the charges: fraud, manipulation, and multiple counts of emotional and financial abuse, and Marcus sat there, unmoving, as the sentence was read aloud. Guilty. The word hung in the air like a weight, heavy and final. Julia felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was mixed with a deep sadness. There was no victory here. There was no celebration. There was only the bitter taste of betrayal and the understanding that the damage had already been done. Marcus was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, but for Julia, the trial wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. In the months that followed, Julia took time to heal. She threw herself into her work, surrounded herself with the support of friends and family who had always been there for her. But no amount of success, no amount of business triumphs could erase the emotional scars that Marcus had left behind. The trust she had given him so freely, so easily, was broken beyond repair. she couldn't just bounce back from that. But slowly, she began to rebuild. She took up hobbies she had long abandoned, traveled to places she had always wanted to see. She started therapy, began to understand the patterns in her life that had led her to Marcus in the first place. And little by little, she found peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from knowing the bad guy is behind bars, but the kind of peace that comes from within, from understanding that her worth wasn't defined by someone else's actions. The truth was out. The man who had manipulated her and so many others was held accountable for his crimes. But for Julia, true closure didn't come from the trial. It came from reclaiming her own life, from learning to trust herself again. And while she would never forget what Marcus had done to her, she learned that the most important thing was that she had survived. And that, in the end, was her greatest victory. The courtroom drama may have ended, but Julia's story was just beginning. A new chapter was opening, one where she would write her own story, without the shadow of Marcus hanging over her. And as she walked out of that courtroom for the last time, she took a deep breath, knowing that whatever the future held, she was ready, stronger, wiser, and free. As the final days of the trial unfolded, the courtroom grew tense. The evidence was irrefutable. Marcus's defense, a desperate attempt to spin his story into one of victimhood, failed to convince anyone. The women who had once been so taken by his charm now sat in the seats beside Julia, their voices strong, united in their pursuit of justice. The man who had shattered their lives was finally being held accountable. And then the verdict came, guilty. The room erupted into a collective breath of relief. Julia's heart pounded in her chest as she sat there, stunned. It was over. The man who had manipulated her, the man who had deceived so many, would finally face the consequences of his actions. But as the weight of the moment sank in, Julia realized something else. This wasn't just about Marcus's punishment, it was about her own healing. For so long, she had allowed herself to be blinded by the illusion of love. She had thought she could trust him, that she could finally allow herself to be vulnerable again. Now, that dream had shattered, but in its place, a new reality emerged, one where Julia could reclaim her power, her sense of self, and rebuild the life she had nearly lost. The months following the trial were a period of reflection and recovery for Julia. She spent time with the women who had stood by her side, forging new bonds of trust, ones that were built on transparency, respect, and mutual support. She learned that the real strength wasn't in the walls she had built around herself, it was in the willingness to open up, to let the right people in, and to never again compromise her worth for the sake of a lie. Her business continued to thrive. In fact, it flourished even more than before. Julia realized that her true success had never been about the money, the accolades, or the power. It had always been about her resilience, her ability to rise above the pain and to move forward despite the obstacles in her path. As for Marcus, his fate was sealed. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a reminder that no amount of charm could shield him from the consequences of his actions. Julia knew that his time in prison would be the least of his punishments. The real punishment was the lives he had ruined, the trust he had shattered, and the damage he had caused to the hearts of so many women who had believed in him. In the end, Julia understood that her journey was never just about finding love. It was about rediscovering herself. She had been lost in the darkness, but now she was finally free. Free to live, to trust again, and to know that she was worthy of the love and respect she had long sought. As the years passed, Julia moved forward with grace. She didn't forget the lessons she had learned, lessons about trust, vulnerability, and the importance of surrounding herself with those who genuinely cared for her. She became an advocate for other women who had been manipulated and deceived, using her voice and her experience to help them reclaim their lives. And though she had loved Marcus, in the end, she found something far greater than anything he could ever offer her. She found herself, and that, she realized, was the ultimate victory. To never again compromise her worth for the sake of a false love. Julia learned the hardest lesson of all, that love should never come at the cost of your dignity, your trust, or your self-respect. She spent time with her family, her friends, and the few people who had never let her down. They helped her rebuild, piece by piece, what had been torn apart. Julia took a long look at herself in the mirror one morning, no longer seeing the woman who had been deceived, but the woman who had fought for the truth. She had confronted the darkest parts of her life and emerged stronger on the other side. It wasn't an easy journey. Healing never is. But Julia understood now that true strength didn't come from avoiding pain. It came from embracing it, learning from it, and using it as the foundation to build something far more meaningful than she had ever imagined. The trial had given her closure. Marcus would never be able to hurt anyone again. His mask had finally been removed, his true nature exposed for the world to see. But the real victory was Julia's. She had faced the worst of her fears and come out victorious, with her integrity intact and a future of her own making ahead of her. As the years passed, Julia moved on. She found new love, not in someone else, but in herself. The road ahead was open, filled with the promise of new beginnings, new opportunities, and the strength to never allow anyone to take her power again. And though the scars from her past would always remain, they were no longer a burden. They were a testament to the woman she had become. If you found inspiration in Julia's story, remember you're never alone in your journey. Trust yourself, learn from your experiences, and don't be afraid to seek the truth, no matter how painful it may be. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with those who need to hear these untold stories. Every click helps us share the truth and bring justice to those who need it most. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Stay strong, stay informed, and remember the truth always comes to light.